that's a problem with a lot of things. I mean, how many pastors are struggling with burnout but don't get help?
Hmm.
Well, a lot of them have reached out for help and just been criticized and feel guilt for it. And then as a result, the next time they feel burnout, they don't get help.
Well, hey, listeners, welcome to another episode of Church Chat, the podcast where we have conversations about ministry that you wish you were having. And today, man, this one is so exciting. I've been looking forward to this one for a long time. And before we get to intro our guest, I'm Josh, one of your hosts.
And I'm Emily, and today's guest is Dr. Jim Meyer. He co-pastors Pocono Evangelical Free Church with his son, JJ, and he's a professor at Cairn University. He's also the director of biblical counseling resources. Just an all-around awesome dude. Jim, welcome to the show.
Welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
I'm so pumped to have you here.
So we like to intro our guests with a little game of two truths and a lie. Jim, take it away.
So I really enjoy being in my canoe in the water. I have very little fear of the water and just joy. That's where I'm just like almost the happiest. Well, maybe not the happiest. The second is I love playing board games. So if you want to play with me, I would love to play with you and just enjoy playing board games. And well, the other one is enjoy being in the ocean, like walking the ocean, by the ocean. So one of them's not true.
Oh, man, I don't know.
I like the narrative style of that.
Yeah.
That made it a little bit more tricky.
I'm also glad we didn't get psychoanalyzed for making our guests lie.
That's true. Mm-hmm.
I don't know, Emily. This one's kind of tough. You got two water-related things,
Yeah,
but you also have sand in one of those situations.
Right. It's a very polarizing
people
thing.
have adverse reactions to sand.
Oh, you're psychoanalyzing me.
Well, yeah,
There you
that's
go.
part of it. Not very well. And also the board game things is interesting too. I have not met a lot of people that have objected to board games. Have you?
My father-in-law is one of those.
He's one
he
of
does
those?
not enjoy, and my uncle, weirdly, and they were both pastors. So
Maybe we're onto something.
maybe it's a weird pastor thing that they don't like board games.
I'm going to go with the sand thing. I think you're lying because you don't like sand. Emily, what do you think?
I actually think it's the board games. I don't think you
Really?
enjoy board games. Yep.
What do
Emily.
you got you?
You win.
Ah!
Yes.
So I was an athlete when I was younger, and I was very competitive.
Uh-oh.
And the Lord had to teach me about my competitive nature, and I get too competitive when playing board games. So that's why I've come to not really enjoy it.
You might change your mind if you played in my house.
Okay.
Things get downright crazy. That's my house, man. My oldest daughter, who's now a teenager, when she was little, I'm talking like real little, 5, 6. Candyland is one of the simplest games ever.
I remember.
Yeah.
She was so competitive, and it's the first time we saw it. We're playing Candyland. We're sitting there playing it, just my wife, Jen, myself, and Taylor. And she lost and flipped the Candyland board on us. Like stormed out. We were like,
What is happening?
what was that? No more board games.
Is she an athlete?
Yeah, she is.
Yeah, that's there's something about being an athlete. It puts that competitive.
Yeah, that's great. The bad part is Emily is now clearly beating me in this game that we play.
I am indeed.
I'm not as good. I'm excited about jumping into this. Emily, I mentioned before, Jim and I spent time. He is often, or when we do it, he's an assessor for church planning candidates. And just, man, really, we sat on assessment before. He was doing like the psychology part of it. I don't know how they call it. And I was kind of there to assess the preaching. So we got to spend some time together on this team, and I was just so thoroughly impressed by him and his insight and wisdom and his care for people. So I'm pumped for this conversation. You want to intro the topic?
Yeah, so we are talking about kind of a taboo topic, I think, in the church world, mental health, counseling, just being a mentally whole person. And you are the perfect person to talk to, Jim, because you are bivocational, right? I mean, you're a pastor and a licensed counselor. What drew you to those two paths?
That's a great question. First of all, it's very interesting. I started in the pastorate and then went to a church as a solo pastor where half of my congregation was struggling with alcohol addictions, half of the adult population.
Yeah.
And really was just constantly having to deal with counseling issues that were far beyond, my ability and my training. Obviously, in being trained to be a pastor, I had some classes, but they were minimal compared to what I was having to handle. So in that situation, I realized I needed more training. I needed more counseling training. And so I went back and worked on a master's in Christian counseling. And after finishing up that, the place where I was doing that, I graduated in '96 from that program after being a pastor for over 10 years. So I went into the pastoral ministry in '84, and in '96 they had me come back and start doing adjunct teaching, and then I became part of the core faculty, and then went on to do my doctorate. During my doctorate, I had the opportunity to become a licensed professional counselor. That's what you call it in LPC. Really wrestled with it, went through a number of different steps because in Pennsylvania, I would have been grandfathered in. And during doing my doctorate at that point at a secular university in pastoral and community counseling, they had it all set up for licensure and chose to not allow the state to dictate what I do in any way. So I chose not to go that route. So I actually counsel off my ordination, as most pastors do. And yet I have both a master's and a doctorate in the field. And then it was a professor full-time for 17 years. Right now, I only adjunct at Cairn University, but was a full-time professor there for 17 years while part-time pastoring during that period of time. So I don't know if I answered your question fully, but what really drew me was people need help. That's what drew me to it. And I didn't have the kind of training that I felt like I needed.
Mm-hmm.
I love that answer. It's indicative of your heart for people driving. I see that in you in the interactions we have. And do you think that there's still some negative kind of connotation in the Christian world and in church world, maybe even in pastors when it comes to counseling?
Yeah, I took a counseling class when I was doing my studies to become a minister, and the counseling class centered around back then two authors, Larry Crabb, who was a licensed psychologist who wrote Effective Biblical Counseling and a lot of other books. But back then, it was this book he wrote, Effective, and he put biblical in there. And so there was a lot of, question, is his style biblical or is it not? And then the other author we had to read and study was Jay Adams, who did what's called nouthetic counseling, coming from the Greek word nouthosis, which means to admonish. So it was more of an instructional model versus more of a clinical ask questions kind of model. And so there has been, to me back then, so that was, late 70s, and I started my studies in '80. So there was a lot of debate about that. And I found that the negative connotation was often over, well, who are you? Are you a Crabite or are you an Adamite? So that's what I experienced a lot of. But interesting that you asked that question because I have some pretty good answers to that. I did my doctoral thesis, and which was a 15 credit, because I have a doctorate of education being a professor, a 15 credit doctoral study. So I had to do a lot of original research. And I researched Evangelical Free Church pastors and their counseling practices. Now, you got to understand, this was over 2 decades ago.
Right.
So I didn't get to interview you, Josh. But I did a lot of interviews. I did a lot of study, and I found something very interesting that most Evangelical Free Church pastors, and I got I got like a 90% return on my survey, and then did all these interviews. So I mean, I
Yeah.
had, pretty solid numbers as far as that goes. But most of the pastors would say that they were nouthetic, they were Adamite.
Hmm.
And yet I had some questions which I pulled from a secular counseling book, and they associated what they did in counseling as being more Crabite
Hmm.
instead of Adamite, where they were doing listening skills, asking questions, and going deeper with people. And so I found that fascinating that most of the pastors would say, I'm more of a nouthetic counselor because I gave that description in one of my questions. But when it came to what did they actually do, they did more the opposite. And so I kind of feel like I'm more in between.
Yeah.
So
So was your paper or like your doctorate focused more on like pastors giving the counseling or receiving?
but no, it was giving. So they're counseling training. So
Right.
yeah,
Okay,
my
okay.
dissertation was more on counseling training, and then but at the same time, the question that that I was hearing from Josh, just kind of looking at how pastors view the counseling, those two questions really fleshed it out, how they view
Yeah.
their view of counseling. That they would say, well, I think Adams is more biblical, so I'm going to say that.
But
Yet
in
when they
practice,
went to loving people, they were using all these secular skills, and I listed them out. There was
yeah.
a list of them. Now I didn't tell them I had listed a secular book.
Yeah. I love that.
It was a sneak question.
Yeah. I love the sneak question. I'm a big
So
fan.
do you think there's okay, so like my brother, I have an older brother, and my mom and stepdad have all done counseling, and this is when I was like an adolescent. So I feel like at that point, especially in church circles, it was a weird thing to be in counseling, and like that you were like really out there if you like needed help from an outside source like that was beyond your pastor, like
Right.
they were going to a licensed counselor. Do you, and I think sometimes kind of generationally now there's still that ethos of like, one, either I don't need the help, or two, like it's a weird navel gazing thing to receive therapy or go to counseling. And I think especially among church leaders, it's like I should have all the answers, or I should be okay. I'm the one that needs to be giving counseling to other people. What would you say to those? And do you think that's still a prevalent train of thought for church leaders?
Yeah, I also help out and sit on the ordination council, and
Mm-hmm.
we get into dichotomy and trichotomy. Are you body, soul, and spirit, or body and spirit? And they're the same
Hmm.
thing. And so that's a question that's often asked in that context. And what I would say is that our physiological makeup in our brain is extremely complex. And
Hmm.
there are times where anxiety or depression, I lost my wife after 22 and a half years to a car accident.
Hmm.
Similar to Josh, losing you lost your mom,
Yeah.
and your dad and I connected very deeply on that level. But my point being is, I went through 3.5 years of really deep depression.
Hmm.
The reality of grief changed my physiological nature of my brain, and I never struggled with depression before, but today I still struggle with depression. Things can trigger it. I have a really great management of it, which I help people who are depressed. So, and by the
Hmm.
way, I'm in pretty good company. I think most of the prophets struggle with depression or
Yeah.
anxiety or both. And even Jesus, when he went to the Garden of Gethsemane, said, "My soul is distressed to the point of death." So you can see the impact that it had on him, even physiologically, where he sweated blood. So I think that it's important to realize that there is a distinction between our physical and our spiritual, our soul. And sometimes the physical is driving it, and a good psychiatrist can help you to get kind of that balance.
Hmm.
Where sometimes the spiritual is driving it, and we really need to kind of examine our soul and where we are with the Lord. I actually have, in one of your other questions, I have a response that basically says sometimes you really need both. And so I often encourage, if you're going to a psychiatrist, go to a good biblical counselor also.
Wow, that's good.
I love that. I love that you're, I mean, like, because I think even still, like, if Christians finally get over the hump of feeling like they can go to a counselor, they're just going to go to a counselor. They don't feel like it would even be okay to go to a psychiatrist or psychologist or whatever, other option.
It's so refreshing to hear.
Mm-hmm.
I have been, and I've told you both know this. Our listeners might not. Hopefully, they don't cancel the podcast when I say this. But after I lost my brother in a car accident, my mom to cancer within a very short window, I did not go to counseling or process it with anybody. I shut off and almost destroyed pretty much everything in my life that is good. So this time, when I lost my dad last year, I decided I'm not going to process it. Like I cannot do this to my family. I cannot do this to me. I need serious professional help. And I went to a biblical counselor for a bunch of sessions who also recommended that I see a psychiatrist at the same time to work on the physical part of
You went to a good
stuff.
counselor.
Yeah. But there's so stigma. I felt it.
Mm-hmm.
Like I felt that like I shouldn't need this. I'm a pastor. I'm spiritual, like if I was just more spiritual, I wouldn't need this. And as I've told my story, I've heard people say that they still get that kind of vibe from pulpits. Why do you think, where does that resistance come from?
Well, I think that maybe for some, and I don't want to judge, I don't want to pass judgment. I think that a lot of pastors have referred people to counselors and thought that they were good, sound Christian counselors, and those people have had some real spiritual downfall as a result of that. So I don't want to judge a pastor who's
Right.
maybe struggles with referring because of that. At the same time, there are a lot of good counselors out there who really affirm the scriptures. I think of Lighthouse with Carl Benzio, who's has been in our area, who is a licensed psychiatrist, and I used to have him come in for my chapels and speak. This guy loves Jesus, and he is very concerned about both the physiological responses to psychological problems as well as the spiritual. And so and what I'm saying is let's find good men like that. And I just mentioned him because he's out there a lot with his ministry, and I know him personally, and I know what kind of man he is. And so I would say, hey, let's truly find let's just find that balance. And I think that that's the problem. That's a problem with a lot of things. I mean, how many pastors are struggling with burnout but don't get help? Well, a lot of them have reached out for help and just been criticized and feel guilt for it. And then as a result, the next time they feel burnout, they don't get the help. And we're working really hard on that. A large Christian organization and Tuscarora Inn and myself, we're working to develop retreats for pastors to really address that so that it's preventative and not just prescriptive. So prescriptive is when, okay, you have a problem and you need this prescribed. Well, what about preventative? We're not doing enough preventative. So the three of us are really working, the director of foundations, the director of Tuscarora. We're all working, and myself, we're all working. And I'm going to run the first retreat in June, just aimed for pastors. And Josh and Emily, it's all preventatively orientated. So hopefully we're doing our job, to change the attitude and the perspective. I've had a lot of pastors who've come to me. I currently counsel 10 pastors right now, and obviously I've counseled a lot of pastors and missionaries over the years, and most who've had real resistance to coming to me after a few sessions just say, this is refreshing, this isn't what I expected. And I believe there's a lot of people out there that can really do that kind of work. But let's be honest, there's a lot of people out there that will maybe subconsciously hate your faith and not, move you toward, they shouldn't do that as counselors, but,
Right.
Not move you to a right place.
I know you're going to be leading a retreat about this, but can you give us like what would be some preventative things that pastors can work on to avoid some of those downfalls?
Yeah, I do a retreat often. I have a bunch of retreats I do. In fact, I just came off of one last weekend. and it was a
Mm.
marriage conference where we looked at the intimate marriage and what does it look like to have intimate marriage. And so I do these a number of different retreats, and one of the retreats I do is and have done a lot, both on the mission field. I've gone to out in the mission field and done this with missionaries. But it's how do you prevent burnout? And one of the ways you do that is look at the life of Jesus. We see Jesus taking active steps in Luke during the height of his ministry. I mean, his ministry is just exploding. He's at that point where you would say, well, you know, uh, man, just keep going. And it says there in Luke 5, it says, he often withdrew into the wilderness. Right. Jesus knew how to make sure he restored himself in his humanity
Hmm.
and did not push his humanity into an unhealthy place. And I think that's really, really cool. And it doesn't say, yeah, every once in a while he did this. It says he often. And I take that word literally.
Mm.
Jesus saw that to be neat. So that's just one thought for those. Are you getting away and being refreshed? If you're getting away and being refreshed, that will make a huge difference when the stressors, can come at you. I had this week, I came off a conference and immediately went to a funeral. And I taught on Wednesday night. I'm teaching Sunday school on Sunday morning, and I'm preaching at my church. The week before, I preached at two different churches. So, it's just like I need some time and I have some time scheduled. I have some actual time scheduled, not this week, but going on the following week where I'm just going to get away and rest.
So that's very convicting. I'm going to need the link for where you sign up for those retreats. How about this? As you look, you have a broad perspective on pastoral ministry, just because of all your connections, all your work, all your history. What would be some things or what concerns you most as you kind of like take a broad look at where pastors are health wise as a whole? What concerns you most maybe about the pastor as an individual?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I started thinking, with particularly the pandemic, and all the issues that have come out of the pandemic, and kind of where a lot of the pastors are. I even put a list here. Burnout being one,
Yeah.
depression. I'm seeing a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, spiritually depleted.
Hmm.
That is a really key element with pastors is they love Jesus, they love God, and they want to serve God and they want to serve God well. But in their own personal lives, they're spiritually depleted. You know, Marriages take a tough hit in the pastor's life because the pastor's getting hit from all different sides. And sometimes the wife in that situation can not be forgotten, but kind of put on the side. And, we really need to, I do a lot. In fact, I just did a marriage conference. I'm doing another one in May. So I'm doing, it seems like a lot of people are asking me to do marriage conferences right now. So that just seems to be such a need, and it's a need for the pastor, such a need for the pastor. And that's one thing I really appreciated about my dad. My dad was a missionary, and he would be gone, 2-3 days a week doing his ministry. But man, he really accessed those times where he was home to really build a relationship with me and my siblings. And I really appreciated that about my dad, that even though some people would say, well, it sounds like you had an absent father, I didn't feel that way at all.
Hmm.
Yeah, the ministry pulled him away. Literally, he was gone for 2 nights, 3 days and 2 nights every week to go take care of part of the ministry where it was further away. And yet he knew how to do that. And I think that's those are, I know I gave you a splattering because everyone's different. But
Right.
the enemy knows our weaknesses and is going to attack in that area. He will go after us as pastors. That's one thing I will say. It's a spiritual.
Yeah. That's very helpful. Mine was anxiety. I
Mm-hmm.
mean,
Yeah.
it just bit me like a snake. I had some panic attacks.
Mm-hmm.
It started kind of like losing my dad pretty quickly. to some issues with his lungs. And then we had a guy try to break into our house while we were there. So like that part of my brain was just red hot.
Yeah.
And the anxiety, I think, built from COVID on, like just not knowing how to deal with it, not knowing what exactly was happening in that part of my physical brain, and trying without the right tools to cope with it, without even really knowing what was happening. It was just unsuccessful until I was able to sit down and have some long and lots of sessions with somebody like yourself telling me, this is what's happening with you. This is what you can do. These are some tools. And yeah, so it's interesting. They say it's different for every pastor.
Gosh, I would love to respond to the issue of anxiety because I have to deal with it a lot as a counselor. We often don't have as good hermeneutics as biblical counselors on anxiety. So anxiety is one of those issues where a lot of pastors feel like, well, Philippians 4 says, be anxious for what? For nothing. So something must be wrong with me. And I know a lot of pastors who I've counseled through anxiety, they've tried it, they've devoted themselves to prayer, but the next verse is, in the peace of God, which it surpasses all comprehension, so guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And they say, where is it, Jim? What's going? And, I point out immediately that in Philippians 2, the same exact word is used. The exact same word for anxiety is used, and it's used in a positive way. And we sometimes lose the flip side, that people who are anxious often care deeply. And in chapter 2, it speaks of Timothy caring deeply. It uses the same word. And when I'm counseling pastors, helping them to understand that, hey, listen, your care for things, even if it's like your care for your home, it's such an important component to understand. And so I think, sometimes as pastors, we just need to study and realize that, boy, we get kind of myopic in our view and say all anxiety is bad. Well, in that case, then Paul was giving us a positive example when, so we're throwing out one for the other. So what I often do in my counseling is I help pastors to see that their struggle with depression has a real positive side. Their struggle with anxiety has a real positive side. I'm going to share something with you I'm pretty open with. My weakness is stubbornness. That's my weakness. I've identified it throughout my life as being my greatest weakness. Stubbornness is pride, Thank God for Jesus, right? Yeah. But the flip side of stubbornness is faithfulness. And so really helping people to understand what God doesn't want me to squelch stubbornness so that I'm just so carefree and, easygoing and just let you jump, all over me. No, he knows that he designed my personality to be extremely faithful too. And so kind of seeing that with anxiety, if I was working with somebody who struggles with anxiety, I always help them to see the flip side. And by the way, I just did that. I can't tell you the information, but I just did that in a counseling session yesterday afternoon, where we're doing a flip, saying, don't throw that out. Don't throw it all out, because there's something that God has created you in that way to be used for his glory.
That's very helpful. I feel like this was just a counseling session. A lot of pastors get it, are called to it, but part of their calling is they just care about people. Yeah. Just care deeply about people. I care deeply about people, about my family. And that's probably the root of a lot of anxious stuff.
So let's not throw out the good with the bad. There are things about anxiety that we do need to work on. So I'm not minimizing that. I'm glad you get help, because you do want to really work through.
Well, listeners, today's podcast episode is sponsored by and supported by EFCA East. EFCA East is a district of the Evangelical Free Church of America. This is a phenomenal association of churches that exist to help develop transformational churches among all people. And they do that by helping leaders live well, lead well, and multiply. EFCA East is here to serve you, whether you're in one of our 6 states that make up EFCA East or not. And I'd encourage you to find out more about EFCA East, the amazing programs and support they offer at efcaeast.com. Listen, my church has been a part of the EFCA East for a really long time. We have benefited greatly from it. I can't imagine doing ministry over the last 10 years without being part of the EFCA East. Their support, their help, the encouragement, the time spent with colleagues throughout the district has been so beneficial, not just to me, but to my entire staff. I'd really encourage you to check out EFCA East, get involved. If you're an unaffiliated church, explore what it would mean to join. Maybe even consider financially supporting EFCA East. They are doing absolutely incredible things to create healthy churches and healthy leaders that transform our world. Check it out. Learn more at efcaeast.com.
So how do you, because I also really struggle with anxiety. Mine's towards more of the medical anxiety realm. So where do you find that middle ground? Is that just you working on it with Jesus? I don't know. And I'm sure it's different for everybody, but how do you start kind of helping them meet in the middle?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that it takes time to really talk it through, to expose it. A lot of times anxiety is under the surface, not being exposed. When anxiety is not being exposed, what happens is you have these panic attacks, sweats, and all these kind of things that if you go to the diagnosis and statistic manual, you say, wow, these are the symptoms. That's what the diagnosis and statistic manual does, is it clarifies all the symptoms. But what we need to do is we need to go deeper and say, Lord, what are you trying to accomplish through this? So not answering your question, but let me just share personally. Through my depression, the Lord taught me things about deeper intimacy with Him that I couldn't have learned without. And so I look at the 3.5 years I struggled with depression after my first wife passed away. I look at those as a gift. I looked at depression, not initially, but eventually I looked at depression as a gift. And I think that we often don't do that. We often look at the suffering and the struggles, and we're more concerned about how do I get rid of it. And I think of Psalm 23, where yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and you can put whatever you want in there. Yea, though I walk through the valley of anxiety. Yea, though I walk through the valley of depression. Yea, though I walk through the valley of, and you can see where I'm going here. Mm-hmm. I will fear no evil because you're going to take it away. No, that's not what it says. It says, yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. And we usually miss the next verse. I sometimes think verse categories have us miss the contextual connection. He then goes on to say, you prepare a table in front of, in the presence of my enemies. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You see, David realized the enemy was still there, but now he was feasting at the table of God. And I think, why? Because in my depression, I realized the presence of God. In our anxiety, we realize the presence of God. And that's why the two need to work together. And by the way, I'm not discounting some legitimate answers from the world of psychology, from medication to, various types of therapy. I'll be teaching in September and October, Cairn's graduate class on trauma and grief. And the trauma part, I go deep into PTS, sometimes PTSD, because D is the disorder, but post-traumatic stress, is very important. And some of what secular science in the field of psychology has given us can be very, very helpful. I usually do some CBT work with somebody who's struggling with post-traumatic stress. I usually do that work with them, but I do it within.
What's that? Those.
Yeah, that cognitive behavioral therapy.
Okay. Yeah.
So I usually do CBT, but I do it also from the philosophy of Philippians 3, where Paul says, "I've learned to count all things as loss," and then developing a whole different perspective.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you touched on the whole medication thing too, because I also feel like there's a huge stigma on that as well.
There is. I get that question all the time. I'm very transparent with my story, and when I talk about my struggle with anxiety and depression in the past, people always come up to me and want to talk and ask questions, share their story, and That's one of the questions I get every single time. Do you take medication? Is it okay for me to take medication? What do you say when someone asks you that kind of question?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, now we're getting into really hard questions. I thought this was supposed to be fun. No, I'm teasing. But keeping it fun, right?
Fun for us,
So,
not for you.
Yeah, maybe not you.
so that's a very, very difficult question because you have strong polar opinions on this. And truthfully, I find myself somewhat in on this question. So first of all, I think that, I really challenge people who are just taking medication because their family doctor, particularly related to psychological issues, just because their family doctor prescribes it, because their family doctor isn't equipped to do some of the analysis that I think is really necessary, that a good Christian psychiatrist or a good Christian psychiatrist can do the medication. The psychologist has extreme training and really understands often the pharmaceutical side of things also. So, I have a lot of my colleagues who are really tremendous in that. So I would go to answer that question. That's a tough one, but I'm going to go right back to Romans chapter 14, where people feel really guilty. And, Paul's addressing meat, eating meat, and then he's addressing what day of the week to worship God. And he says something in Romans 14 to me that's just so powerful. He says, let each be convinced in his own mind. And Josh, that's what I really try to do with somebody who comes to me and says, I don't know if I should be taking these meds. There are side effects to meds. So, and we have to understand those, and we have to research those, and we have to consider those. Now, I would come back to say, don't depend on your meds. Like that one king who sought the physicians for his feet rather than sought God. Don't depend only on the medication. Also make sure you're seeking God in that. So there needs to be a counterbalance. But I think, as it comes to medication, I mean, I know people who probably would be dead today from a human point of view if they weren't on antidepressants.
Yeah.
They probably would have taken their lifeline. The antidepressant is very helpful. Am I someone who's going to go and tell them, as a Christian, you should get off your meds? You see the foolishness of that?
Yeah.
So I'm very, very careful not to push a person one way or the other, but to say,
Right.
You need to be convinced in your own mind what is right for you. And then to really genuinely go through both the positives and the negatives. What if you can't, you can't sleep and you haven't slept for a week? We going to criticize you for taking meds to help you sleep?
Right.
Well, you need to sleep. You see what I'm saying? So
yeah, you're kind of like talking about that balance between soul and physical,
Absolutely.
and like you can't disconnect them.
Right.
And to understand who God made us to be and the theology of the fall, you really have to understand how our bodies are breaking down.
Absolutely.
And so you can't just write off that your brain is a physical part of your body that pumps some very strong chemicals God designed,
Yes.
in God's design to help us experience how he wants us to experience life. But it's also part of our fallen world. And those chemicals get out of balance, just like, like my knee doesn't have an ACL anymore, like.
Neither does mine, by the way. so
I like
again,
that answer, because it kind of brings that consider all who God made you to be and all of how he designed us to function.
And we would be very sympathetic to somebody who's going through dementia, taking medication to help their thinking and processes in that situation. And by the way, I have a number of people I pray for weekly who, are struggling with dementia. But let me tell you a quick story that really helped me. My dad had a very serious heart attack. And so only 60 to 40% of his heart was working, and it couldn't pump enough blood to his brain. So eventually it produced, a form of dementia. And I was sitting there one day, and this is just a beautiful story. And I wish this wasn't just vocally, because I'll just illustrate it so the two of you can see, since we can see. But he would just look up at the light and smell his hands. And that's what he would do. And I have some training in my doctoral studies on geriatrics and counseling. So I was doing everything I knew to do.
Mm.
And one day I simply just asked him this question. I said, "Hey, Dad, are you still praying?" And he actually turns his head, looks at me, and says, "Oh, yeah." And in his eyes, I could see his soul, that
Yeah.
beautiful soul of my dad.
Mm.
His brain was going, Josh. His brain
Yeah.
was completely going, but his soul was still there.
That's
And he was
beautiful.
letting me know, "Jim, I'm praying for you." And the day he died, I went to visit him in hospice care. And I visited him and I said, "Hey, Dad," because he couldn't really communicate at all at that point. "Hey, Dad, I'm going to go preach." And he looked at me. It was like, I'm praying. And he died while was preaching.
That's beautiful. Hmm.
So yeah, I think we have to be very, very careful to realize how interconnected those are, and how at times medication can help, how at times it can interfere, and understand both sides to that.
So is it? Here's just a simple yes no, and then Emily can hit you with another question. Is it okay for pastors, leaders? There's lots of people in ministry to take medication.
Well, I would say absolutely yes, if they are convinced in their own mind from the
Right.
Lord. Who am I to judge them? Right?
And maybe don't just go see your family doctors. Also, what I'm taking
Mm-hmm.
away, see a
Absolutely.
Christian psychiatrist, psychologist who can give you good, solid advice on the meds, and also is going to be paying attention to mind and soul.
And again, it's so easy because our copays are so low when we go to our family doctor, just to take the cheap way out. It's not the cheap way out.
Mm.
Mm.
It's not the cheap way at all. And I realize that most people, your insurance won't cover a psychiatrist, and finding a good Christian psychiatrist can be even a challenge today. So my referral basis of Christian psychiatrists have shrunk over the years. So I still have some, but they're not many, that I know out there, practicing. So it can be a challenge.
So that actually was going to be one of my questions. If somebody's looking for a good counselor, how would you go about doing that? Because I feel like I would probably benefit hugely from being in therapy, but the one Christian counselor I know goes to our church and I do work for her, like website wise. So like that would be like a weird conflict of interest, and like we want to keep our friendship intact. That probably wouldn't be a good relationship. We live in a kind of a dead zone for that. And I'm sure there are other people who run into that issue as well.
So that's a really interesting thing, that the whole dynamics of the pandemic has changed. The whole Zoom counseling, which I do a lot of, I'm counseling people from far and wide, and then some that come. But and I've had pastors, because I've asked really in the beginning, what has it been like to do this, over online? And almost to everyone I've asked that, they've said, it has been great. I feel like you're right here in the room with me. So things have
Mm.
changed in that dynamic. Zoom has been an amazing extension of our ministries, when it comes to something like that. But you have, in our area, we have Foundations that has, I think, 15 counseling different sites. So we have, pretty much wherever you live, you can actually go to a site and meet with a counselor. But they do a lot of online counseling too. And Foundations is the Christian counseling that I'm working with to develop help for pastors. So we're working hard to do that. So we have good organizations like that. Depending on where you are, it may be that you pull up one of these good counseling places and just go online. Would be my recommendation. And I would
That's
start
great.
there. First of all, it's a lot cheaper than going to see a psychiatrist, unless somebody is suicidal. That's a completely different issue.
Right.
But unless somebody is suicidal, or unless somebody is considering harm to themselves or something like that, I'd say, hey, why not start with a biblical counselor? And we can do that now online for a
Hmm.
very reasonable amount.
That's awesome. So I want to pivot. We have, just a little bit of time left, and go back to more of like the pastors giving counsel to people. My husband is a pastor, and we were talking about our chat this morning, and that was one of his questions. He's not trained in counseling, but I know like people tend to always come to their pastor first,
Mhm.
when they're dealing with something. Do you have like a good rule of thumb of like at what point do you need to refer them somewhere else? So just like I can't take you farther than
Right.
I'm not equipped?
So first of all, I think that pastors have a lot deeper impact upon their parishioners' lives than most counselors will. So that's
Mm-hmm.
why they come to the first, is because um, you've invested, your husband and Josh, you've invested into their heart, into their life. Pastors are trained in the scriptures and understand many things and can give deep insight into a people's heart, and so I wouldn't minimize that at all. In fact, I would recommend that if that they continue to care for that person even if they refer to another counselor. But at what point do you refer? And that is when the when you don't have the answers that are needed in that situation. But so that's the context of referral, is when I don't have the answers for there's some eating disorders that I am very equipped. I've taught on eating disorders, um, but the truth is, I try to get somebody through the first part of their eating disorder, and then I refer them to people who are really good at it.
Hmm.
And so that would be an example of a pastor saying, this young teenager's coming to me, and their parents are coming to me with an eating disorder. It's clearly an eating disorder. What kind of help? There would be a case of working with the family for a couple sessions, getting the teenager used to counseling, connecting with them, and then saying, hey, I know somebody's really good at doing this. Would you consider seeing them? And that requires pastors to build a referral, a referral base for them. But let me say one thing more about pastors counseling. you know I think if you can ask good questions, you are a good counselor. If you look at Genesis 3, what God does with Adam and Eve before doing any kind of instruction or any kind of judgment, he asks questions. Where are you? Did God know where they were? God knew where they were. So why is he asking, where are you? The next question, who told you? Who told you you are naked? I mean, these are fantastic. And then you go to chapter 4 and you see a God interacting with Cain. Why are you angry? Why has your countenance fallen? And the Hebrew word for why can be what or who or how, or so you can broaden that question out. A lot of times counselors don't use why questions because it's interrogative, but those questions are just a wealth of understanding of how we interact with people. I would say pastors need somebody who asks good questions of them. And then we need to be pastors who ask good questions. How many times did Jesus ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
When you read the Gospels, it's just full of great questions, and so that's a skill that I think every pastor can on and build and grow in.
I like that question. When do we refer? How about when do we seek for ourselves
Mm-hmm.
professional help?
Yeah. First of all, I think, when do we refer for ourselves? I think
Yeah.
the answer comes to this. Josh, we all need help.
Hmm.
My dad wasn't a counselor, but my dad was this amazing man that I spent a half hour in his office. I would just go in his office, sit down, and spend a half hour. I was refreshed, was ready to go.
Yeah.
That's the kind of people we need in our lives. Sometimes they're counselors, sometimes they're mentors. I shared with you in the beginning, I do a lot of mentoring with pastors, also not just counseling with pastors. Why? Because if a pastor doesn't have a mentor, they need someone speaking into their life, in their heart. And so to me, that's what's really important. I have key friendships that I know that will speak into that. And so the answer to your question is, when do we need professional help? The key to that question is help. A lot of times we need help because we haven't gotten the help long before. Many people who've come to me, their issues, let's say pastors struggling with pornography, or pastors struggling with drinking, or pastors, by the way, pastors struggle with those things too, just like everyone else.
Yeah.
The problem was, or pastors struggling with their marriage. The problem was they didn't get help long ago. And so now they need professional. To me, the key in answering that question is, pastors, let's look for help. Who is really
Just do it.
helping us in those areas that we struggle? And it doesn't have to be a licensed psychiatrist.
Right.
It can be someone just like, I think your dad and my dad, Joshua, are a lot alike. They're just the kind of people you spend some time in their presence and you're refreshed.
Yeah.
I know we're, closing in on our hour, but I just have a follow-up question. I feel like maybe there is pressure from within to not get help, but I think for pastors especially, there would be congregational and probably societal pressure to not struggle with things. I mean, we look like, obviously there's a level of accountability for leaders that is God-given, that they are held to a higher standard than other people. But what can congregations do, or maybe I'm off base and they should just feel the pressure to like not struggle, but like, what can they do maybe from the pulpit or in their own leadership to just make it acceptable for everybody to struggle, them included? They're all people. We're all people. We're all going to struggle.
There's a long answer to that. So I'll try to make it short. We have taken out of our worship portions of Psalms that are lament, that really, we love Lamentations 3, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. And we completely miss verses 1 through 18, where Jeremiah is saying, God, you've broken my teeth with gravel. I mean, these are, 18 verses. I call it 18 years of just battling with God. First of all, Emily, we need to make it okay for people to be struggling. Jesus told us we would suffer. He told us that. So we need to become acquainted with the fact that there are many difficulties that we will face. And so, but I think that particularly in our culture, we've made it like inappropriate to say, like Psalm 13, God, have you forgotten me forever? David is just going after God. He's saying, what's wrong with you, God? You see my point? And we've taken that out of the Christian struggle in church, but it's real. And so we have to let people really struggle. Now, I will say this, and this is vitally important. There are unsafe places to do that. I'm not telling people now go to your church and start sharing openly your struggle. But we need to find those safe places, small groups and different community contexts and deep friendships where we're able to just share our burden and not be judged and just be accepted. And then I love how the Psalms end. I love how Jeremiah ends. He takes all that struggle, all that lament, and he comes to great is thy faithfulness at the end in Lamentations 3. That was a short answer to a really long question, or a long answer for that question.
It's something that, too, I think, it's teaching all of that, holistic approach. And also just being, this is maybe where people get hung up. It was hard for me to start being really transparent about the struggle I was going through grief or anxiety, those kind of things. I found that in my circumstances, it's been very helpful to the church and healing for me, and kind of changes the expectation or whatever when you start talking about stuff, and it's not maybe appropriate for pastors to talk about everything from up front, but we can certainly be a little more transparent about sharing some of our own struggles. And I found that's been healing for me. It's been healing for people in my congregation.
I'm particularly open with my congregation about some of my struggles. I keep it general, not specific. So I think that's vitally important. It's now everything's online, so you have to be careful. But I think it's vitally important. And I used to teach the pastoral counseling class for the MDiv students, and that's the Masters of Divinity students. I used to teach that class, and I'd always tell the pastors, hey, listen, if all you're doing is studying the Word of God to preach a message, and you're not studying the Word of God to let it impact your heart personally, you're going into the pulpit really without the proper perspective.
Yeah.
So, that's something that, again, I think really means, hey, we take it to heart ourselves. Thanks for sharing that, Josh, that you're open with your people. Being vulnerable is kind of the first step to people experiencing their pastor as being genuine.
Yeah, I remember the first time you told me about the loss of your wife, and you were so honest about the depression that you walked through and the dark days. And I remember a couple of things. One, it was almost like you gave me permission to be honest about that stuff that I was also going through. And it also really drew me to you. I thought, this is a guy who's just real and on. I love this man. I'm sorry he's gone through this too, but there's almost a connection that came because you were willing to start first and share your story and then give me permission to admit, hey, yeah, I'm having some really tough days too.
That's so cool.
There's something beautiful about what happens. It's scary. I mean, It's scary, but there's something beautiful too that comes from that.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to also recognize that people have taken our words and established in the back too. So that comes back to what I said earlier, finding safe places, safe people.
Right.
People who aren't do that. I think of, in James chapter 5, where it says, confess your sins to one another. And that's a present imperative, a continual command, and immediately interconnects it with and pray for one another. So many times we confess our sins to somebody and they've gone and told everyone else, where the scripture is very directive there, to connect, So I share particularly deeply with people I know who will pray for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. This has been really helpful and encouraging.
Yeah.
Good.
That's really good. I'm so grateful for this conversation. We have those two other questions I'd so want to get to, but I don't know if we have.
You can. At least can be
Do
a
you
longer
have a couple
one, so
more minutes, Jim?
I'm fine with it. Yes. Yeah. I'll be glad to.
Good.
Maybe you could give, a lot of us have children. I grew up a PK. I suffered. And my parents were great. They were great with us. But it was a different world and different expectations on pastors and their families. Not a lot of boundaries. What's one piece of advice you could give pastor, ministry, parents who are raising kids in kind of the fishbowl of ministry?
Just to give you context, I'm a missionary kid from Japan and also a third culture kid because I grew up in another culture. My wife was a missionary kid. My first wife, who died in a car accident, she was a PK, preacher's kid. My kids are, kids of preacher's kid. And so this is a really question that I really hone into and know that so many of our missionary kids and our preacher's kids have such a bad taste in their mouth about the ministry. And I know that this is simplistic, but we have to make it about our relationship with Christ and not the ministry. And I have 5 siblings and they have all different takes about, growing up in the ministry and the stressors of coming home on furlough and having to act one way and,
right.
And all that's involved in being a missionary kid or a preacher's kid. And, again, it's not about quote ministry. It's really about our relationship with Christ. And, I knew your dad well enough to know that he was about Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important for us in our families to say, this isn't about ministry. This is really about Jesus. And that's what my relationship with you is about. And really making that a fundamental part of how we approach it. Because if you don't, most of my missionary kid friends, even some really close friends, but most of them, man, they hated the ministry. And then there's a few of us, maybe about 20%, who are all in ministry.
Yeah.
It's kind of an interesting dynamic that happens. But I do think we need to make it about Christ. I really do.
That's really insight. I've never thought about my father from that perspective. Ministry got messy, but he was very like, this is about Jesus. And all of my brothers, I think we went through periods where we kind of hated church, but we all still sort of somehow, sometimes clinging by our fingernails, love Jesus.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why, so far we've made it,
Yeah.
It's a great perspective. Just last question before we kind of wrap. What are some hidden pains that you think pastors are carrying right now?
Yeah, I have a big long list on that one.
Good.
So I I
Let's
won't
hear it.
I won't expound on them, but just almost any pastor who's been in ministry long enough has been abandoned.
Hmm.
Mm.
Rejection and abandonment. It's a huge thing, and it leaves scars. It really does. In our culture, people don't know how to leave a church. They just don't. They don't know how to leave a church. I've had hundreds of people leave to move away and just say such blessings to me about how meaningful my ministry was. But those few who have left angry, maybe more than a few, there's been more than a few actually. Usually they blast me on the way out.
Yeah.
And you feel completely rejected. You feel completely abandoned. And I think that we have to really work through that and wrestle with that. See, I wasn't going to try to say a whole lot about these because I know we're time.
No, I want to hear these. This is gonna be good.
Go for it.
That's a big one. I think as pastors, we feel misunderstood. I don't know how many times, you say something and then you hear it come back. And one of the ways I've been really misunderstood is how I've handled people who have said things about me, but haven't been honest. And then I have kept that information confidential. So somebody has a really, really bad marriage, and I know very specific details, but they present one thing and leave all of that out as to why I directed them in a particular way. It makes me look really bad, and I feel misunderstood. But the fact is am I going to hang on to my integrity? Or am I going to fight back by divulging what I consider to be somewhat confidential information? Those two lead us to feeling alone. I've asked this question when I'm wrapping up counseling with pastors. I've been counseling pastors and missionaries for now 27 years. So I've been doing it quite some time. And when I wrap up, I often ask the question, who are you going to go to, as we wrap up, who are you going to go to get this kind of encouragement and help? And I don't know how many times they've turned to me and said, "You're the only one, Jim. You're the only one in my life right now." And often in that case, they say, "Well, we're going to have to continue maybe once a month until we can really develop that in your life."
Man, I feel that deeply. Like I almost got choked up right there. Just the other day, I'm driving home, not wanting to take this stuff in ministry home and lay it on my family or kids, respecting that boundary. I'm like, I got no one to talk to about this.
Well, I have a much longer list, but that would be a good place to stop. Those are three things that are just so true about pastors.
Okay, but now I have a follow-up question because of that one.
Sounds good.
So, and what Josh just said. So, like, how, as a pastor's wife, can I be helpful? Because I do understand that there probably needs to be a boundary, that it's not healthy for pastors to just dump things on their wives and family. But knowing that we are also, as a spouse to ministry leaders, somebody that is trusted and that can be, where's the boundary there? And how can I, as a pastor's wife, be helpful?
That's another question that we could spend a lot of time on. I've had, my first wife was very helpful in the ministry, but Kathy is just a real source of encouragement. And she knows how to really step in and encourage me. Rhonda knew how to really complement my ministry in other ways, but Kathy has just been such an encouragement. Although she does get pretty angry sometimes when things in the ministry are tough, So, I mean, and then I have to remind her, this is what God has called us to. But I think that, that whole idea of looking to encourage in the midst of the struggle, sometimes that's just being there, just kind of being available and finding, ways, Emily, and to the pastor's wives who might be listening to this, the ways that you can really minister to your husband. Kathy, my wife, really knows those ways and ministers to me and in a very powerful way. And we have a complicated marriage. We have a large blended family, 16 grandkids, which are great. My grandkids don't distinguish between stepkid and, they just know us as grandma and grandpa. So it's been really exciting. But, it's complicated. It's not easy. And, we've had to learn how to really negotiate through those troubled waters so that we're not allowing our own stuff to then infiltrate into the ministry. And I could go on and on and on, but I won't.
I know. I feel like I think we say this every time, but we definitely need to have you
Yeah.
on again. Because I come from a blended family as well. So I have like so many questions about that. And I would love to hear more about
We need to have a
your
blended
wives.
family small group where
Yeah.
people can
Hmm.
really talk about it.
Yep.
And has happened in our culture is blended family is so common that
Hmm.
the church really isn't addressing. And
Hmm.
that's a real issue. And I'm not talking about all churches, but the church is not genuinely addressing the complications of blended family. I Here I go again, but I was the professor at one time that was supposed to teach on blended families before I had a blended family.
Mm.
And I went to seminars, I read everything I could, I studied, I was all up on how to counsel blended families. Boy, did I know very little. Now that I have a
Oh
blended
man.
family, I understand so much more than, and I think
Mm.
that that's a blessing that God has given to me is really understanding blended families and the complication of it.
Hmm.
Well, I think what we're going to have to do is we're going to have another opportunity to chat with you on this podcast. And maybe we can just run down the full list. It can be an episode where we just talk about the hidden pains of pastors, maybe, and really push in. I think
Hmm.
that would be, I hope you're up
Be
for that.
really,
That would be very
really good.
helpful, I
I'd
think.
love to do this. This is great. This is something I really enjoy. So yeah.
That's great. We end our sessions with a question that can be serious or fun. It doesn't have to be spiritual. Just we ask, what's saving your life right now?
It's
Emily, you
saving
want to
my
go?
life.
Yeah. Well, what's
Hmm.
saving your Emily? You want to go first?
Yeah. So my husband and I just got back from a few days in Florida. We were at the Exponential Conference, and not only was the sun saving my life, it was like we landed in a conservatory. It was like moist and warm. It was delightful. We live in upstate New York, so it's still very much winter here. But I sometimes when I'm at conferences, and there's like 3,000 people there, a lot of people worshiping Jesus, which is delightful. But sometimes I feel like overly. This is my overthinking part of myself, but like this seems so self-serving. It's like it is all about us, obviously Jesus, but like we all love Jesus, and here we are. It's just not outward focused. But I left feeling very refreshed in that sense. Like I just sometimes to avoid burnout, you need that like spiritual encouragement punch in the gut of like, hey, we're all like, yes, let's go. It's a little bit of an emotional hit, and that was really helpful for me. I think I was in need of that, so that's what's saving my life right now.
I'll go next, and then Jim, you can wrap it. That's beautiful, by the way. I think the team that God has blessed me with, we had a couple hurdles that I was worried about the outcome of ministry wise. I have a very unique and bigger team, though they're not all full time. Man, just everybody's giftedness it really hit me as a gift this last week. Seeing the community the way God designed it, seeing how, we're all different parts of the body, and just how much pressure that took off me, relieved some massive stress I was carrying about a couple of events that we have coming up was just like such a blessing.
Well, I was going to go fun,
Yeah,
and
go
Go,
then
fun.
please go fun. I'm usually the
well,
one that's
yeah,
like, yay, super
yeah.
fun and light.
So
So
to me, it's it's walking, walking on the beach, being in my canoe. It's just those times where I'm just able to sit. But you did strike a chord with me, and co-pastoring with my son
mm,
has
Uh,
just been such a blessing. And I just think this week how my son jumped in different times in different places, and how he's jumping in next week, and just how well we work together. And we were able to drop the me being the lead pastor a few years ago, and we're just now co-pastoring and trying this whole idea of what does it look like to co-pastor a church together and stay in our lanes and learn how to. And
yeah.
he was here right here in this room just with me in my office just yesterday, and just spending time just connecting and talking. Man, that saves that the Lord's given me real blessing there. So,
I love that for you guys, by the
mm-hmm.
way. As someone who got to work with his father, it's such a fun, amazing blessing that you guys get to share. And JJ, a spectacular dude and
yeah.
pastor, by the way. Just great guy. Well, Thanks so much for being here, Jim. We don't have like a fancy way to say goodbye. We should probably work on that.
We should probably.
I don't know how to end these things, so all we kind of do
High
is we just say, see ya.
Yes, high five. Yeah, virtual high five. Bye.
See you guys. The Church Head Podcast is for educational purposes only. We dive deep into important and sometimes sensitive conversations and topics about life in ministry. Please know that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely the views and the opinions of the guests and the hosts and do not necessarily represent the organizations that we work for. Nor should our views or opinions be considered a full perspective of circumstances that may be mentioned in this podcast. Our perspectives are limited, and so will be this podcast. What we hope to do is have conversations and spark greater conversations that will lead leaders and their organizations towards greater health. The Church Chat Podcast is edited by Emily Gardner and produced by Emily Gardner and Josh Ott. The Church Chat Podcast is supported by EFCA East, an Eastern District of the Evangelical Free Church of America, covering 6 states. EFCA East helps leaders live well, lead well, and multiply, helping churches find new vitality and multiply transformational churches on the East Coast. The EFCA is multiplying transformational churches among all people. For more information, visit efcaeast.com. We hope you enjoyed this podcast and can't wait to see you on the next Church Chat episode.